Line 1. It is time for something big and new. We are at a point in the semester where it's time for us to acknowledge that not all verbs are present tense. You know, actually, I'm going to get some coffee before we do this. I think I really want some coffee for this. You know, you might want some coffee too, if you're that kind of person. Some people are not that kind of person, but if you are, go ahead and grab some. Okay, I'm ready now. So up until now, we have seen one kind of verb, and every kind of verb we've seen have all been present tense verbs. Every single verb we've seen has been present tense. All right? And I know sometimes you guys have been tempted to translate them in the past, and there have even been times when people translated them in the past where I didn't actually correct them because, we were trying to get through a thing or whatever. And the way our textbook is set up, these stories sound, at least a lot of them sound like they ought to be in the past. And eventually they will be, but we have to learn what the past tenses look like first. And as it happens, that is actually a topic of chapters that are coming up real soon, okay? Chapters 13 and 14 sort of introduce the imperfect tense, okay? Now, I don't know if you guys know the term imperfect tense or not. Some of you may, but I'm sure everybody is at least familiar with the idea that verbs can come in the present or the future or the past. The truth is a little more complicated than that, though. There's more than one way to express the past tense, and the imperfect specifically is, at least in English, when we use was or were plus an ing. All right, you guys got that? Was or were plus ing, which is not the only way we do the past in English. In English, we also just stick an ed on things sometimes. In English, we also use helping verbs like has or had sometimes. We can also use did. So we have a lot of options in English for how to make things past tense, and the Romans have a few too. The Romans specifically have 3 past tenses, okay? And we'll talk about what the distinctions between all those are later. But for right now, we're going to add what is actually the easiest one, which is cool. It's great that we're starting easy. And I think the imperfect is easy for a couple of reasons. One is because it uses the same verb stems that we already know. If you've been paying a lot of attention to your verbs, if you've watched the other verb videos and you know how there's a stem and then there's an ending, well, those stems are still what we use, but we're going to have to add something to the ending to make these verbs imperfect, all right? So if you look at a verb like this one, good old amo amare, it means to like or to love, definitely a verb we've seen several times in our story so far. Right? It's a first conjugation verb, which is to say our stem is the ama. I've got it underlined in red over there. ama. Now, if we were in the present tense, we would use that stem and we would start sticking endings right at the end of that stem. And that's how we get amo, amas, amat, etc. But for the imperfect, we're going to add a ba. We're still going to have personal endings on there. You can still see an m in place of an o, but otherwise the rest of them are the same. st, mostis, but we have a ba in front of all those things. So amabam, amabas, amabat, which is to say I was loving, you were loving, he, she, or it was loving, and you continue in the same pattern on the other side. We were loving, you all were loving, they were loving. We're just literally sticking was or were plus ing in English, and that's the equivalent of putting the ba in Latin. Now, I did want to go ahead, and this video is probably going to be kind of long. I did want to go ahead and show you examples from the other conjugations as well, just because we have not had nearly as much reinforcement on what our verb stems look like. So for the second conjugation, those are the stems with a prominent E. Not only did I underline the stem in red, I went ahead and put little red long marks above those E's. I don't always write long marks, but the thing that distinguishes the second is a long E, a strong E in its stem, and so flay is my stem. That's the verb that means to weep, or it's one of them. There's a couple, all right? It's also my favorite verb, just because I think it sounds pretty. Fleoflare. And of course, if it were in the present tense, we would have flay, and then we would have our endings right after that. Fleo, flaes, flet. But in the imperfect, we're just going to add a ba. Same as we did in the first conjugation. So you have flebam, flebas, flebat. I was weeping, you were weeping, he, she, it was weeping, Yeah, it's the exact same principle. We're just applying it to a stem that ends in E, all right? And this makes imperfects real easy to recognize because you're just always looking for that BA. That said, there are a couple of things that can be tricky, and of course, those problems begin in the third conjugation. Now, the third conjugation also has an E at the end of its stem, sort of, right? Like, the E in kogere is weak. And because it's weak, when we learned this in the present tense, we didn't conjugate it with an E. We conjugated it with an I, because somehow the weak E got turned into a weak I. Well, when you're adding a BA before your endings, the weak E actually doesn't get turned into an I. You actually get to see an E and use an E. Now, be careful with this. This can be real tricky, especially when people are learning how to conjugate. They have a real bad tendency to conjugate thirds just like seconds, which actually in the imperfect is kind of okay, but in the present it's not. So be real careful here. Or they will remember to use an I in the present and then try to use an I in the imperfect as well, and that's no good. You're not going to use an I in the imperfect. It is in fact going to be an E. Kogebam, kogebas, kogebat. This means to like force or compel. So this would be like I was compelling, you were compelling, he, she, it was compelling, etc. Okay? Now, it is also worth pointing out the fourth because there is like a little hitch here. Even when people remember the third, sometimes they do make little mistakes in the fourth, and this mistake is not a devastating one, but it's still kind of a common mistake, right? In the fourth, we know that the stem is audi, A-U-D-I, right? I've got that underlined in red there too, because the fourth is characterized by a strong I in its infinitive. It's why the I shows up in front of the O in the first principal part, audio. And so, on that logic, you'd think it would just be Audi. That would be the end of the stem. Audi bam, Audi bas, Audi bat. It's not, though. For some interesting reason, I'm sure it's fascinating, you also need to put an E in there, too. You are using the AUDI and an E. Audi bam, Audi bas, Audi bat. This is like probably the most common mistake made when people conjugate the imperfect, is they leave the E off of their fourth conjugations. So this would be I was listening, you were listening, he, she, it was listening, we were listening, you all were listening, they were listening. Same pattern as before. Now, try as you guys might. I know there's a handful of you out there who have really been trying to ignore or forget that there is such a thing called the third I-O. Yes, there is. There's a third I-O. But really, it's nothing that you need to be panicked about. You need to know it exists, but honestly, when you look at these forms, it can seem tricky because you see an I in the first principal part and then an E in the second principal part, right? And it's technically a third because it's a weak E over there, but yeah, regular thirds don't have an I in the first principal part. But, when you actually come to conjugate it, just know to do it like the fourth. That's true in the present tense. It's true here in the imperfect tense. It's going to be true in other tenses you don't know yet. So this verb means like to like want or to desire. So we have, I was wanting, you were wanting, he, she, it was wanting. It's a little bit different from our irregular verb wolo. But yeah, it means to want or desire. You can kind of see the name Cupid in there because Cupid is desire. So before I leave off, I thought I might show you a couple example sentences that have imperfect verbs in them. So that way you can actually see them at play and see how they're being used. So when you look at this one, it says, my cats were loving to sit on the kitchen table, right? Our nominative subject up there is mes felies, my cats. We've seen that before. Our verb, I put it down here at the end, were loving, all right? And then what they were loving is to sit on the kitchen's table, or on the kitchen table, right? Now, when I say they were loving, what this is it's in the past. And if you wanted to, in a sentence like this, you could probably get away with, just using a simple past, they loved. But I'm using the imperfect specifically to point out that this is not a thing that they loved to do once, that happened once and then ended. This is a thing that they were loving to do all the time, and that's part of the reason why you use the imperfect. Like, the point of the imperfect is to, yes, describe things that happened in the past, but things that were happening in the past over long periods of time, or things that happened in the past over and over again. Not, the kind of thing that happened once and then was finished, right? You could also compare, like, to this sentence, right? It says, the cats because I was forcing them off the table were weeping, right? What's going on there is that, my cats weren't happy that I pushed them off the table, but this is not a thing that happened once. This is a thing that happened iteratively, over and over again. So, yeah, I use the imperfect for that, right? If this was a one-time event, I would use a different past tense if they got on the table once and I pushed them off and they were sad. But this happens every day. They're cats. They love being on the kitchen table, right? And if you want to see just one more example, it says there that always we were listening to the cats or for the cats who were desiring to sit on the kitchen table. And you can see I've got my first person imperfect, audiebamos, we were listening. My third person plural, cupeabant, they were desiring. And again, imperfect because these are things that happen all the time. They're kittens, they're going to get on the kitchen table, but you have to tell them no because no matter how much you love your cats or how much you are a cat person, cats do not belong on the kitchen table, all right? They go places and they do things with those paws, and you've got to keep that stuff clean, okay? So hopefully this is making sense to you guys. Obviously, we're going to talk about this more in class, and watch for follow-up on imperfect verbs as well. Did I say imperfect verbs? I mean irregular verbs. Well, irregular verbs when they're imperfect. So I'm going to get out of here so we can talk about those other things.